All right, good afternoon, everybody. Can folks online hear us? Give me a little feedback.
Yep, can hear you.
With us as we finish an extended series of stakeholder meetings we've been doing over the last several weeks. There were several members and staff to the commission here. Erica Williams, Roy Williams, who will say a few words in a few moments, Bishop Zand, and Carolyn Rudd, commission members, Len Lee, the chief financial officer for the district, and a special member of the commission. We're all, a few members are traveling, but we'll catch up via the recording in the minutes that we have. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of where we are in the process and our work. Today's conversation fits in. And then I'm going to give you guys a chance to introduce yourselves and a few highlights of what you want to say. Then we'll open up for questions from commissioners and discussion. We have a little bit of a smaller group in this panel than we did in the previous one, so we'll have a chance to have a broader conversation. As you know, the council and the mayor have appointed this commission to do this every 10 years by statute. It's an 11-member commission. The last commission back in 2013 came up with some pretty major changes that were advanced, and many of which were actually adopted. So we are following in big steps this time. At the same time, that a lot has changed since 2013. Changes in the economy, changes in the tax base, changes in community priorities. And so we think we have a really important opportunity at this time to really cast an eye across the entire tax system, top to bottom, and propose to the council and the mayor a full set of changes. That this commission has adopted a set of principles that are guiding our work. The commission has committed to, number one, following the data, which the recommendations are based on sound research. Number two, paying attention to the experience and the needs of people across the district and opening up our ears to hear diversity of perspectives. And number three, working collaboratively to come up with a set of bold and thoughtful changes. In the commission's recommendations, members have agreed as a body aim to achieve all of the following. One, broader, resilient tax base for a post-COVID economy in order to protect against economic shifts and shocks and ensure the future funding for high-quality public services and to share tax burdens fairly across the community. Number two, progressivity and racial equity in the tax code, eliminate racial disparities, protect low-income residents, and lift up our middle class. Number three, economic efficiency and competitiveness in order to advance growth and prosperity for all of our residents. Number four, simple, open, and fair administrative processes in order to reduce compliance burdens for residents and businesses. We will be assessing our proposals against these principles, and in particular, I want to note that analyze the impact of proposals on racial equity in the district to the extent that data allows us to. So where we are is, as I said, over the last 3 weeks, we've convened 10 meetings with small groups and key stakeholders like all of you who we think can bring important perspectives and implications. We had a public meeting earlier this week on Monday night at 8. We have another public meeting tomorrow night. That was virtual. The intent is that we want the general public to come, bring their perspectives, hear their they have to say, ideas they may have for the commission or just perspectives on the tax code. We are planning additional sessions for later this summer. We've already had conversations with some of your organizations about how to think about designing and scheduling. Our job in this session as commissioners and as staff is to listen. Haven't ruled anything in or out. challenges that face our tax system, and we've been listening carefully and taking notes of a lot of policy proposals. A lot of things that we face in our tax system don't necessarily lead easily, directly, or clearly to solutions. Technical challenges, complex trade-offs, and we're continuing to grow and develop our list of options that we have to address some of the challenges. So as we go through this process, I really want to invite you to continue to weigh in, not just today, but on an ongoing basis as our list of policy options is developed and sorted through. The plan is that we'll be continuing to have briefings, discuss issues over the next few months. By the fall, we'll begin to refine and narrow down our list of potential policy options. By December, our intent is to agree to a final package of recommendations presented to the council. As we refine and develop the proposals for consideration, we'll continue to post them on the website and top level. Again, really want. We know we have a challenging task ahead of us. We're excited for the challenge. In this conversation, as I said, we're all about listening and learning from you. We're happy to answer questions that you might have about the commission's work and how we can do better. And mainly, we're listening. You're not going to hear a lot of opinions from us. Even if we think you have a great idea or a terrible idea, we're going to from saying what we disagree. You might ask probing questions. So we'll begin by letting each of you introduce yourself, share your name, your organizational affiliation, your sharing notes, and a brief summary of what communicative perspective you represent at this table, and as best you can, a high-level summary of ideas for the work of this commission. You know, at least a couple of you have already submitted written materials, which I've already read and carefully. So we'll go, each of you speak, and then we'll open it up. And we're not going to go into like each of them. I know we sent out a bunch of questions, question by question, or following up. So let me stop there and leave it turn to our chairman to say. Welcome and thanks, everybody. Turn over to you. I have one speaker online.
Sure. Would you prefer we not read what we prepared, as everyone's read that, and just give a high-level summary of that?
That's my preference,
Okay.
but I don't want to preempt it. Some people will feel like
Yeah.
I have to read it.
No problem. Okay. I'm Scott Goldstein. I am the Executive Director of Empower Ed, pronouns he, him. We are a teacher advocacy organization. We were founded in 2017 to take on the challenge of teacher turnover in DC, which is substantially higher than both other places in the country and also comparable urban districts. We experienced a 30% turnover from last year to this year in terms of teachers leaving their schools. And so that's one of the challenges we take on, as well as making sure there are diverse educator voices that are at the table in important education conversations in the district. And we are based in, just to give you an idea of where we come from, we have a cohort of about 25 to 30 educators every year that form our representative group of educators that match the racial, ward demographics, experience level, what subjects they teach, elementary, middle, high, all of those, to be a representative group of educators from across DC. So just to give a background on where our ideas come from and the teacher-based solutions that we propose. I really want to, in the context of taxes, talk about the imperative that you all, as you named to begin with, especially about progressivity and racial equity, where our schools are in comparison to where they ought to be. I think one important thing that I'll highlight from my testimony is, as many of you probably know, there was an adequacy study done in 2013 in reference to our schools and what sufficient funding needed to be. We're still substantially behind that adequacy study, and that adequacy study is 10 years old. And so we're going through the process of obtaining a new one now. But even if we look at the old adequacy study, we are far behind where we need to be, especially when it concerns our at-risk students, or students, for example, who qualify for public benefits and some other categories. I want to lay out just briefly a couple things that I highlight here, which is first that I think all of our schools substantially need more funding. And there are many ways in our current education systems in which schools obtain the funding they need because of wealth inequality or access to wealth that doesn't have to do with our tax base, in which I feel like the tax process or tax system should be helping to remedy that it does not sufficiently remedy right now. And that has to do with whether schools have parent, teacher, or family organizations that provide substantial assistance. Schools have access to outside support from philanthropy or corporate donors and support. And so there are many schools in which you have full funding of staffing needs, outside partners, and enriching experiences for our young people that you do not get at many other schools, and including ones who serve a comparable student population because of access that some schools have and some communities have. I think our tax system has a responsibility to try to address that and remedy some of those inequalities. I mean, obviously, we are in a city where the history of Black codes, Jim Crow segregation, redlining, all of those things have created a pattern where, not dissimilar to other places, but in some ways extreme here, that we have housing segregation that contributes to educational and school segregation, and that our tax system has to play a role in trying to disrupt that by making sure the resources are where they need to be to make sure that our students all have the same opportunity. So there's a lot of ways in which this becomes real in our education system. If you think about the kind of things that we want for all of our kids in their schools, and one of the things that I like to highlight the most, we're in a time right now where we just had a pandemic, and we're talking a lot about gaps in learning and learning loss. And what we highlight is where students are in math and reading. We have extraordinary number of people. And if you look at, for example, Black students and reading proficiency in the city, where we are nowhere near our goals, right? In terms of students being able to read on grade level, students being on grade level in math, in some cases on average 4 or 5 grade levels behind where they should be. And that's exacerbated in some ways by the pandemic. That is just looking at the academics as we look at reading and math. And I think where funding for schools plays a huge part is what kind of experience do young people have in schools outside of those traditional areas where we're focused on just reading and math. For example, if you go to some schools, you're going to experience the investment in the school building, the investment in the teachers and staff. The school means they have extraordinary outdoor space at the school, means they have art programs and music programs and language programs that are enriching, meaning that the students experience experiential and project-based learning and field trips and a whole lot of enriching components of school that we don't get in other schools. I think part of the role that equitable tax system can help play is to try to level that playing field. Or this is reflected also in our school buildings and where we are there. And I'll just name that a couple political context questions, and we can get into this more in the discussion, that we are in a situation right now where there is kind of a battle between the chairman of the council and the chancellor of DC Public Schools about how we fund our schools, where the chairman put into place a bill called the Schools First in Budgeting Act to try to make sure all schools stayed at least at the funding level they were at in previous years. And then there's very sharp disagreement about whether that's equity. And I think it's a very nuanced conversation there. But the premise of the conversation illustrates that even at the extreme end of let's put a whole lot more money in our schools, that would still just be keeping our schools essentially stable at the funding level they're at now, which illustrates, I think, that our tax system is not sufficiently addressing how do we advance and do better in our schools, because I don't think anyone thinks that what we're doing right now and our proficiency levels and whether students are experiencing is enough. And so if the political conversation right now is just about how do we restore school budgets to be held harmless, that means we don't have enough money in the system to actually advance from where we are to where I think our students need to be. So I'll just say educator compensation is one other thing I highlight. The W2 just got a new contract. Substantial money was put into that. Some of that money came from federal dollars, workforce investment, and other places. And that's because, again, our tax system is not sufficiently invested so that only local funds could actually cover a sufficient contract for educators, not to mention half of our students attend public charter schools where they might not have the same level of educator pay. So there's a lot of areas when it comes to enriching activities, experiential learning, basic supplies, where teachers throughout the city go online to fundraise for basic supplies on a routine basis, where we can illustrate that our tax system is not doing a sufficient job making sure every student has what they need to succeed.
Hi, I'm Ariel Levinson Waldman, founding president of TEDx DC. Mission of TEDx DC is to safeguard the legal rights and financial health of DC residents who learn, particularly those facing debt, credit challenges. Serve residents.
What's the organization again?
The organization is TEDx, spelled T-Z-E-D-E-K. It's this beautiful word from the Bible, means justice. So the idea, right, is to increase community members' access to justice by providing support for those facing debt and credit-related problems. We're headquartered service. We're headquartered proudly at the UC David and Clark School of Law. We serve residents in all 8 wards. We come at this issue, like so many of the people around this table, with a focus on racial, particular, repeating things you already know, but just to frame this up, our clients are living in a community where, because of decades of more structural racism, are statistically typical white residents had 8,000% black residents. On top of that, private debt collection efforts, as well as public governmental debt collection. It's a disparate impact on black residents. That's why we do this work. And we've put in formal testimony, and I'm grateful for all the diligence on the commission for writing the testimony, to Nick for reading every word already. I want to highlight really one issue. Just as I do that, I want to acknowledge President Tubatsky, our policy director, Steve Jefferson, leads our community outreach work, which is really key to infusing. This is something that was said in the last panel, which I really appreciated. This is not just about self-appointed fancy people coming up with theories. This is about listening to the community. So one of the things that we commit to, along with our outstanding panelists on the last panel, part of that process, that leads our community outreach, which allows us to do that and to be in that dialogue. It's so important, both our efforts and to the institution. We made a number of recommendations in our submission. Basically, there are 3 buckets. One is just looking at the entire fines system. That, for example, we already fine and fee DC residents more per capita than any city in the United States. And the current budget is poised to trickle down on that strategy. In addition, looking at why it is that year after year have a budget that depends on the collection of fines and fees on top of taxes to funds and services. Those scope of this commission's work, the strategy that said, here's what we need to have a robust DC government. Let's have taxation that provides that, and not look to fines and fees, traffic cameras, balance the budget. And then third, and this is really what I want to focus on, and I'm grateful as well to Glenn Lee, serving on this commission, because I believe that for over 2 decades, our law has put the CFO in the position of having to enforce the deeply flawed law, the Clean Hands Law. And this is not the fault of the CFO. The CFO is a highly professional office. They're required to enforce this law, and the consequences of that enforcement fail every single metric that Nick articulated at the beginning of this meeting. Why do I say that? Our law right now, as the scheme, disqualifies tens of thousands of residents living in poverty or near poverty, from getting into the workforce, from obtaining a educational license or a small business license. We license over 125 different jobs. So we have this really messed up current system that excludes our residents from the workforce system, from pursuing their God-given talents, from pursuing their chosen occupation. You want to be a nurse, you want to be a cosmetologist, you want to be a barber, you want to be a plumber, you want to be a construction worker, you want to be an HVAC cleaner. You can't do it if you have unpaid fines and fees from the government. CFO has no choice under the current law but to disqualify any attempts to send a certificate to the relevant licensing agency. And the impact is highly regressive. It badly fails racial equity standards that are set up because District of Columbia is wealth tax breaks. And on top of that, it's totally counter to the outstanding objective also infusing this commission's work of getting people into the workforce to bring in tax revenue. People are either not having any job at all or having a job in which they make less than they would if they could pursue their chosen occupation. We have clients doing this is happening every day, working with them on forming solutions. Simplest, cleanest, wisest solution is for the council with what we hope will be this commission's recommendation to abolish or very significantly reform this law so that at a minimum there's an inquiry made into members' financial situation, any members' ability to pay before we drop this incredibly heavy hammer of kicking you out of the workforce. This law operates on the ground by saying if you have accumulated fines or fees that in aggregate exceed $100 for a fine and the current records outstanding in Illinois, you are unable to get that small business license or unable to get that occupational license. An error is irrelevant. The exclusion is automatic. Circumstances are irrelevant under the law. There's no inquiry as to pay, as I noted. And let's be honest, for those of us around this table who can afford a parking ticket, this is just not that big of a deal in our lives. Hop online, put in our credit card, and move on. And for folks that cannot do that, the consequences are severe. Clean hands law bars them from obtaining that job license, that occupational licenses. And it has the effect of creating and perpetuating a poverty trap. And this is all done in the name of revenue generation, which is why I submit to you that it fits so squarely within the scope of calling tax revenue. But taxes are about creating revenue. That's what this is all about. Fines and fees, material, approximately 3% of the annual revenue coming in. So, number one, we urge you to put this on that list of issues that you engage seriously with. And number two, on one of your resources to consider whether to make that recommendation. Again, just thank you for your.
Thank you, Art. Appreciate it. I should have mentioned at the end as we go into the Q&A, this gizmo standing here is our not just a speaker, but also a microphone, just got cameras in. So we noticed in previous sessions sometimes it's swallowed. So mindful to project into it.
That kind of looks like a face there.
Yeah, it's called the owl, and when
I
you plug
know.
it in, it makes this. Please go ahead.
Sure. My name's Mark Thomas. I'm with SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, Local 32BJ. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on the panel and for all of your work. So Local 32BJ is a property service union. We represent janitors, security officers, other property service workers, and airport service workers in the region. So we have about 20,000 members in the region at all three airports, at federal government facilities, DC government facilities, Those are contracted out workers and not direct government employees. But the bulk of our members work in commercial office buildings like this building as janitors and security officers. And our members are from, I think we added it up once, 64 different countries, speak many, many different languages, largely an immigrant workforce. So these are, you know, people that are working hard to keep the district running and keeping the city running and are, you know, working, basically the work. They've worked hard to raise standards in the industry, wages, and to win wages and benefits, but organize them together. But a lot of those gains are being eaten up by record inflation. So inflation and the crisis in the commercial real estate industry downtown, these are perilous times. So the opportunity to look for equity and to look for ways to make working people's lives at the lowest end of the spectrum in terms of wages better through tax policy is a great opportunity. So I'll be fairly brief. You know, the child tax credit that the federal government as part of COVID policy, I think was lauded universally, well, not universally politically, but universally among policy experts, at least, as being extremely effective way to combat extreme poverty. With the expiration of that at the federal level, there are ways that the district government can help propagate some sort of similar policy or take up that slack that would have enormous impact on our members, be extremely beneficial. In the same way, expanding the scope of the earned income tax credit, similar things. So those are really our two top line priorities. How do we, you know, for people who are working hard that are caught in this vice of high inflation, coupled with exacerbated by extremely high housing costs? How do we design and expand existing programs that can put more money in their pockets to help them stop living like that? In addition, I mentioned the crisis in the real estate industry. You know, it's particularly bad in DC because of federal largely remote. It's unclear how much longer that's going to continue, or if it's going to change at all, or if we're in a permanent right to work situation. So we've followed with great interest and support some of the initiatives to convert commercial office space to residential space. Spoken with the mayor's office on that. And there was a small kind of pilot program last year. There's a five-fold increase in this year's budget that has been proposed. We absolutely support that. However, what we'd like to see job protections and job standards in that. So if we have a workforce in the commercial office world that is, you know, making significantly above minimum wage and have health benefits through our collective bargaining agreement, and then this workforce moves to a different sector, the residential sector, which is by and large unorganized, no benefits, then it's a race to the bottom or back down to minimum wage. No benefits. So what we would like to see and propose is any kind of subsidies that support this really necessary goal of figuring out what do we do with all this space. Comes with standards attached to the job. So if you're the beneficiary of a tax break to do the conversion, then you also have some responsibility to not just on the construction side, but on the ongoing building and maintenance side, keep baseline of the standards for jobs. So those are really my main points. Happy to follow up with questions or more detail here.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Sure.
Matt?
Great. Can you hear me? Great. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to join you virtually today. I came down with COVID earlier this week, so obviously did not want to attend in person. My name is Matt Hansen. I'm the Chief of Staff at DC Action. For those of you who are not familiar with DC Action, we use research, data, and a racial equity lens to break down barriers that stand in the way of all kids reaching their full potential. We're home to several initiatives, including DC Kids Count and several coalitions like the Under 3DC Coalition, which fights for quality, affordable childcare, the DC Out of School Time Coalition, the DC Home Visiting Council, and the Youth Economic Justice and Housing Coalition. We are also proud members of the Fair Budget Coalition and the Just Recovery Campaign. And through both of those efforts, work with our partners to advance budgets that serve the needs of all residents, especially Black and Brown ones, to advance a racially equitable and just tax code. I think there's a lot of things that the district does really well and that we have a lot to be proud of. And in fact, we're one of the wealthiest states in the country, or would be one of the wealthiest states in the country. But I think one thing that we need to do a much better job at is how we distribute those resources equitably. According to the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, roughly 1,500 households have a net worth over $30 million and hold nearly half of all wealth in the district. I hope one of the tax policies or proposals revisions to the code that the commission will consider is how can we tackle extreme wealth concentration, because it means that a handful of our residents are able to live lives beyond most people's wildest dreams, while others forgo basic human needs and have to make impossible, difficult choices. These are very real issues for the communities and constituencies that we work with. We're a children and youth advocacy organization, and unfortunately, roughly 1 in 6 residents live in poverty, and of those residents, just shy of 30,000 are children, and about 20,000 live in extreme poverty. So there's a lot more that we need to be doing on that front if we're going to help reduce poverty and youth and family homelessness in the district. We understand that local revenue growth is projected to slow, which means that unless policymakers make changes to the tax code, they'll be forced to make difficult cuts to the budget. And these cuts will result in more families being forced into poverty, lacking access to basic services, and ending up homeless. Failure to advance a more progressive tax code will lead to this kind of budget austerity, and unfortunately will ultimately slow down the economic recovery too, and exacerbate the pain that a lot of families are going to experience. We hope that the commission goes in the opposite direction. Austerity would not only be an irresponsible thing to do, but it would also be deeply unpopular. We know the vast majority of residents from recent polling support raising taxes on wealthy residents or corporations to prevent these types of cuts. In terms of things that we could do or should be doing, I think to alleviate poverty and help reduce racial income and wealth inequalities in the district would be to support a robust child tax credit. When the federal government passed one during the height of the pandemic, or enacted one during the height of the pandemic, we saw a massive drop in child poverty. And to me, it seems just like one of the most common sense things that we could do to make a real immediate difference in the lives of tens of thousands of families across the district. So as the commission engages with the public and prepares recommendations for the mayor and the council, I hope you'll prioritize your commitment to racial equity and protecting low-income residents above all else. The tax code, as we all know, is a powerful tool, and I think we can use it to rebalance the economy. If we don't do it now, though, I fear that we'll be in a much worse, more difficult situation when we meet again in 10 years. I'm happy to talk more about the issues that we work on, some of our specific recommendations. Otherwise, I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm going to turn it over to members of the commission to ask questions that they may have.
If folks taking a position on federal workers return to work, which is a big part of the economy in DC right now in terms of, I mean, we're, in danger of losing a huge chunk of the existing tax base because of the loss of federal workers. It seems like the AFSCME and AFG were kind of neutral or agnostic or kind of pro stay at home. But this is the tax base.
I can start. We absolutely have, you know, our union, and I know a couple other unions, are public and out and supporting and actively talking to the administration about what we can do. So we're with you 100% on that. If there's ways we can collaborate, we'd be happy to.
Yeah, no.
It's essential for our,
Yeah, I
for this.
appreciate that. And one other question, one thing I've heard, and we heard in the earlier session is, reiterated time and again, keep it done, I know, but anyway. The child tax credit and child support needs to be expanded on. At the same time, we heard last night, and I think everybody would agree, DC actually does well compared to other states. Now, I'm sure you would argue, and there's a lot of evidence for that, that's a low bar. So what specifically would you recommend that we would do to improve family and child support when you have the rollback of the federal protection right now, when that winds down? Do you have any ideas, or just fill that federal gap? Or?
This is Matt. I can weigh in briefly on the child tax credit. I should say it's a little difficult to hear some of the speakers, so I hope I heard the question correctly. Right now, there's obviously legislation that's been introduced by Councilman Parker to implement a targeted child tax credit. I believe it's up to $500 per child. I think that we need to do something a lot more ambitious if we want to take a significant bite out of child poverty in the district. I know another recommendation that's put forward by the DC Fiscal Policy Institute is $1,500. There's also a $3,400 credit that the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy has estimated would, I think, essentially eliminate child poverty in the district. I think that if we have the resources, we should try to pursue those goals. To me, there's not really a good argument against it if we have a policy mechanism that we know can essentially eliminate child poverty. Not to do that, it puts real money in the pockets of working families, primarily Black and Brown families. And I would argue strenuously should be one of our highest priorities.
Add on to Matt a little bit, which totally supportive of that. I think we should be as ambitious as we can be on that. I want to just talk about the kinds of impacts that has in some way, which is that from my angle in terms of talking about schools, for people to be successful in school, obviously food insecurity, housing insecurity, all of those things greatly contribute to their ability to succeed in school. The basics of childcare, I have two kids who are 5 and 7. I know the expenses of childcare when they're young, but even when they're in school, the costs of childcare to the average family are prohibitive. And I think I want to talk specifically about the cost to the average worker who doesn't have access potentially to aftercare programming. This is something we're trying to increase and absolutely needs more investment from the tax system in. If you work a job that extends past 315 or 330 and your kids do not have access to aftercare, and we do not have that universally in our system right now, you do not have childcare, and for that childcare is often going to cost you more than you'd be making at the job that you're going to be in. That disincentivizes people then from being in the workforce. So there's a huge issue there. Even if we're just talking about the limited expenses of childcare that happen after you're done paying the huge monthly expenses of early childhood education. So there's a huge amount of need there, and I agree that we need to be more ambitious about how much goes into that.
Thank you.
That's the summer months.
And then the summer, yes.
We meant child care ways, support for the child as well as support for the parents by child care.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. And we've just taken steps in terms of the child care workers themselves, the educators themselves, so that as well.
Yeah. Scott, do you mind if I jump in and just, buttress, what you were saying too about early childhood education and after school education too. We've obviously talked a lot about, as an organization, DC Action, about the importance of early childhood education and fully funding the Birth to Free for All law. we made the investments to help raise wages for early childhood educators, but obviously sort of the next step in that is affordability. I think making serious investments there will give families the stability that they need as we navigate the sort of future potentially rocky economy, but also I think to emphasize your other point, Scott, too, about after school time education or after school time opportunities. The DC Policy Center just released a really fantastic report, I think, detailing the scope and the needs of out of school time in the district. And it's obviously something that we can't just turn key on and fully fund one day to the next, but we need to start making those investments. And I think in addition to providing relief for families, giving families greater economic stability, which I think leads to a more resilient tax base, we should also think about the second or third tier effects. And I think, especially when it comes to out of school time opportunities, we have a real responsibility to ensure these are adequately funded because they provide real community safety for young people to have a safe, supportive place to be after school, and for working families to know that their children will have a safe, supportive place to be after school. And so we're essentially able to feed two birds with one hand, funding these types of programs and initiatives.
Echo each of the comments that panel colleagues have made, and just put a note on where we are, which is 3 years after beginning of the pandemic. If we've sort of, as a policy focused community, or nothing else, it's that now, if it wasn't the case before, now it is definitely the case that wealth is health. And so all these conversations about dollars and tax credits going to the families are terrifically important on their own terms, but we now really see, if we didn't before, the very significant sort of broad consequences of making or not making the investment choice across the range of both tax policies and then, as you've heard in just the last couple of minutes, all these affirmative choices to provide additional resources to, to the families in need.
Thank you.
Couple of things. I mean, one, Martin, you mentioned expanding the earned income tax credit. So I wonder if you wanted to say more about how you wanted to see that expanded.
Here I'm going to admit my very insufficient knowledge in the tax code, and so I would say that's a sentiment and not a policy proposal. How about that? But I'm sure that there are lots of folks that could help, work with it to get something specific there.
I also was gonna just actually pick up on something we just said, Scott, about the impact of poverty and food insecurity and those kinds of things on kids when they come into schools.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you want to say more about, because I think there's, I'm sure there are folks that hear like, oh, schools need more funding and they spend a lot.
Yeah.
But if you want to say more about kind of like what schools and teachers are doing, because it's my perception that it's a lot more than teaching.
Yes. We've come to expect schools to do just about everything. I think that there's a downside to that potentially. There's a failure underlying our expectation that schools provide all of the services that our society has failed to adequately fund and provide for our residents. But there's also an upside to that, which is the school is the hub of a community. And so the school is a great place in many ways to provide a lot of those services. And so one of the ways we think about that now in education policy is the idea of community schools or connected schools that we have here in DC, which is that the school really serves as a hub where you would have health centers. For example, Mary Center is embedded in many of our schools. You'd have health, you'd have dental, you have after school services, you'd have connections to job opportunities, you have youth training programs, job opportunities, and internship kind of based things embedded in the school. So you bring all of the services to bear directly at the school, so families have a one-stop shop. And it's an incredibly effective model. There's places, for example, in Baltimore that have scaled it up much faster than we have here in DC. And so what we're talking about now in terms of the investments we're able to make in those kinds of models are adding a school or two a year That's a very slow pace when we have, over 200 schools to get to where we need to be in terms of providing all those services to young people. So schools are expected to do a whole lot. People are coming into schools with a lot of needs. And I think that we are very focused. I would say just this is getting into the academic part a little bit, but one of our kind of philosophical mistakes, I think, in education, if we just spend more time teaching them reading, if we just spend more time teaching them math, that we're going to raise those test scores. And in many ways, we've tried to do that for a very long time without seeing success in closing academic achievement gaps. And it's because there's so many other things around the child that needs to change, including the family's ability to be invested in their school and their education. And that has a lot to do with what our tax base is providing those families outside of the school or through services that we funnel through the school building.
I'll keep asking questions. Matt, I wonder if you, so you brought up the Birth to Three for All law, maybe say more about what that has and like how much it will actually cost to fund that. It's just a law that's currently on the books, but not fully funded.
Yeah. For those, I guess, who are not familiar with the Birth to Three for All laws, passed unanimously by the council in 2018. I think it's sort of like best or most popularly known as sort of like the child care law, that the goal is to help make childcare more affordable for families in the district, so that no family pays more than 10% of their income to childcare. But it also helps fund a variety of other existing programs and initiatives to provide essential health and mental health support to new families and children. And so we have made an initial investment in it, thanks primarily in part to the Homes and Hearts Amendment Act a couple years ago, to establish the Pay Equity Fund and start to raise wages for early childhood educators. That's, I think, the other sort of key component of it. I'm a big believer in the idea of a caring economy that we should invest more in and make sure that we're rewarding care work, child care workers and others, but also that we have an economy that cares about people, especially working families. We have not yet made the investments in the affordability piece of the law, which means that the average cost of childcare is still north of $2,000. Unsubsidized care is still north of $2,000 a month per family, per child. So sometimes more than what a family pays for housing in the district. And if it's not more than what they pay for housing, it's certainly almost guaranteed to be their second highest cost expense. We need, I think, don't quote me on this, sorry, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but we need probably another couple $100 million to fully fund the Birth to Three for All law, to make sure that we can really sort of build this bridge from our great and successful paid family medical leave law to our pre-K for all, to ensure that we have continuity care from birth through early adulthood for children and youth in the district. And it's something that we think the Tax Commission should really prioritize. I'm happy to say a little bit more. I'm not sure if I lost the thread at the end.
We've been having conversations here about both, like, what does an adequate revenue system look like in the decade ahead, but also a lot of conversation, I feel like, about people leaving the district and like what can be done to keep them here. So I just thought that was important to raise. I don't know, Ariel, if you want to say anything about
Well, I'll just build on what you just said, which is that here is a policy that is driving people to either move out of the district or, I mean, I'll just give you one example. It's hot off the press. One of our clients is dealing with this right now. She is a district resident. She's a district native. She's a Vincent resident. She is a licensed speech therapist. She wants to serve this community. Black speech therapist in a community that is almost half Black, where only 5% of our speech therapists are Black. And she would like to be in this workforce. She's talented, she's qualified. And district law says she can't do her job here. So she took her skills and LeBron James style went to Maryland, and that's where she practiced it. And she actively seeks to work in this community. And here is a policy. There are many others, and you suggested them in the tail end of your question. But here's a policy that's just driving our workforce away, and it's kind of productive. And it's low hanging fruit. I don't know if your question was getting.
No, yeah, no, I think that's right. And we've heard a lot about clean hands from pretty much every panel that comes through talking about clean hands. So, you're a large company. And I wonder if you want to say more about like the options. So, I mean, I heard you say abolish, but what would a more reformed or restricted?
Well, one question that is always good to ask, which I think a lot of our council members pay attention to, is how does it work in the rest of the country? And here the answer is, we are the only place that does this. In our self-appointed progressive or quasi-progressive or centrist jurisdiction, among the full range of California to Texas to Florida to Arkansas, the District of Columbia is the only jurisdiction in the United States that punishes people who have unpaid fines and fees by excluding them from the workforce. Which sets up a strong argument for abolition. That said, there are things short of abolition that could be done. For example, we could have a process that at least differentiated between those who plainly have the means to pay but aren't, and those who don't have the means to pay. A simplified example that has been discussed but not adopted would be to say, for those who have already gone through a DC-based or federal government-based means-tested inquiry about to become eligible for, say, SNAP or food stamps, and an inquiry has been done putting that community member under a certain asset or income level. The analysis is done. It's there. It's already available to the government. Say for at least this part of our community, we are not going to pile on the harm by punishing non-payment and with the exclusion from the workforce. It would be an incomplete, kind of unsatisfying resolution, but it'd be a lot better than what we have now in terms of a textured or tailored or partial fix.
From a kind of tactical point of view, it doesn't make more economic sense. At least let you start the damn business.
At least let you start the damn business.
Because you can't start the business, so you're broke and I'm broke. So what good is that? I mean, right? I mean, that would make any sense. Right.
Yes. Thank you for saying that.
Can't do something on this, right? Income-based.
Yes, although I want to distinguish a little bit, because and thank you so much, Steve, for raising this. There's sort of a couple of different personality things going on here. One is, on the front end, how much is a fine going to be? So there is a movement, and you alluded to California. This also happens in Europe and in some pilot programs throughout the country. And the idea is, Jeff Bezos and a nursery school teacher are going to react differently to financial incentives. And if the goal of fines and fees is to incentivize good behavior by the community, we should recognize that. Current structure treats Jeff Bezos and the nursery school teacher the same. It's just a flat, aggressive number. And the idea in California and elsewhere is there should be some proportionality. And so there's a movement called the day fine movement that says you should have people respond to roughly a day's worth of, or some fraction of a day's worth of wages. So there's that piece on the front end. Belatedly, I should say, there's just a kind of question of are we setting the numbers too high? Should a certain offense carry with it an automatic 100 or 200? There's the raw number question, then there's the proportionality question. Those are on the front end. And then to Eric Williams' question, then we have the issue of, okay, if we are going to set up a system in terms of the consequences for non-payment, where we're going to continue the punishment, but at least have some exceptions for indigency, what's that going to look like? And now you would do some kind of inquiry with that ability to pay to at least protect the group of folks that, you can't draw blood from a stone. We're not going to, this is overwhelmingly group that's not going to pay. The CFO will eventually reflect that in a write-off. And so it's in many ways sort of not meaningful not meaningful receivables on the books from an accounting perspective for the DC government. And it's wreaking havoc on the community member under the current rule.
So it used to be CRA working with the CFO and especially, like, I don't think that's the driver's license for rubber side joints, but maybe other occupational licensing permits, things like that, right?
Yes, and
So
no.
now it different bureaucracies to deal with.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for raising that. So the council has already shown it can do this. On the issue of driver's licenses, we made this change as a community in legislatively 2022. And there's also a court order now that said the order was unconstitutional. The Councilmember McDuffie introduced a bill, terrific bill, that would have addressed driver's license disqualifications, occupational license disqualifications, and small business license disqualifications. For various reasons, only the driver's license piece became law. So the council now has, it's a great opportunity for this commission to kind of lift this up for the council, now has the opportunity to come back on the unfinished business of forming Clean Hands Law's application to occupational licenses and small business licenses.
1997 Taxation Commission considered a different type of business tax, which was for that commission forward as an, if you adopt a different type of business tax, then you can eliminate corporate income taxes, unincorporated business taxes, plus like business license fees. If this commission were to look at something like this, or do you see what I mean? Like if you eliminate business license, I mean, you'd still have to get a license.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think at the very end of your question, you shouted out an answer that I very much agree with, which is you still have the yes, no. Can the individual get a business license? Are they barred by the clean hands red light or not? And then the question becomes, what's the fee going to be? And so the clean hands law goes to the red light, green light question, and then you have the fee schedule issue as well.
Can I ask you one more question, just to like circle back?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you said a lot of the workers that that are members within 32BJ are immigrant workers, and we did expand the earned income tax credit last year to folks who may be undocumented
Yeah.
and have to file their taxes with an individual taxpayer identification number.
Right.
Although some may use, may not file their tax or may use some other form.
And I think Maryland just did the same.
Maryland's done it.
Yeah.
We are sort of facing an issue where, one, there are kind of high barriers to getting an I-10. And also, then sort of having to circle back a year after this gets implemented next spring to actually get the earning income tax credit. I just wonder if you've heard or if you all engage with your members about tax filing or those kinds of complications.
We have a legal fund that our members have access to legal counsel that will help them with any legal issue, including taxes. So I haven't heard it come up yet, but we're sort of getting ready and making sure the attorneys in our legal fund are aware and can point people to that.
it might be good to just, I don't know if it's even just you all connecting with your legal fund, maybe connecting with OTR about
Yeah,
barrier questions, because one of the things we want to make sure, or that DCFBI has been working on, is talking to OTR about how if folks can't get the ITIN, what's the workaround so that they can get the credit? Because the whole idea was like to get the credit to folks who don't have a social security number,
right,
right? So
Right.
it might be good to.
yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Just add one comment on the topic of earned income tax credit, just something that we are hoping to follow up on. It's, yes, we absolutely should expand the ITC, which has had a strong start. It points out, but there's room to go. We also want to make sure that attention is paid by the council. And in some cases, this has to be addressed by Congress when it comes to federal benefits, but DC benefits and federal benefits that turn on income, assets received over a period of time. It's critically important that we not give with the left and take with the right. That is, that we not have an increase in the EITC, but then that trips up the community member and they're no longer eligible for a DC benefit, or for example, a federal Social Security disability benefit. So it's something I'd love for us to be able to come back to the commission on offline and identify some of the corollary benefit eligibility questions and need to track that important EITC work.
For the presentation of this, if you have any research that you've done about the products.
Yeah, we did pass legislation last year because one of the things that happened with our EITC is now it's being paid out monthly, starting this year, portion of it, and then it'll be the whole amount each years. So to exempt those monthly payments from being considered in eligibility determinations for C public benefits, like things that we have control over, but there is still this question about like the federal benefits and like what the impact is and what we're prepared to do to safeguard folks from being penalized.
Alan?
Yeah.
Okay. Martin, can you say more? Do you have any more you want to share about what your members are experiencing in terms of the crisis in the downtown real estate market? It seemed, I'm going to guess, but you should weigh in. It sort of has two flavors. One is the impact of just when offices are not being physically occupied by their tenants, when people are not coming into work, and so presumably landlords then make adjustments to works, downward adjustments, I'm assuming. And then what happens when actually, expire,
Yeah,
and landlords are not able to find a new tenant, or at least not able to find a new tenant at the rate of rent that they were hoping for. I'm curious how that flows through to your tenants and sort of your thoughts about, outside of the situation where a building can be converted to residential, which obviously not many buildings, that's not an option.
right.
How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so, I think at first there were, started COVID, kind of massive layoffs. We just thought, okay, we just got to weather the storm and everything's going to come back. Obviously the most commercial office buildings that are multi-tenant, the owners stagger the leases so they don't all expire at the same time, so they have some of that stability. So some of the initial shock was sort of buffered by that. In other words, tenants, even if they weren't using the space, were still they still had a lease and were still paying rent. As those leases now start expiring, the tenants are, downsizing, reevaluating where they want to be, how much space they need. And so we're starting to see the full effect, and that's going to be kind of continued phase in. So as that starts happening, then investors start looking at commercial office as, okay, we don't want to, this is not an area where we're going to invest, and the money flows elsewhere, and it's sort of a cascading system. And then at the same time, the revenue that, ultimately our members work for cleaning contractors that are hired by the building owners. So ultimately, it's, the building owner is sort of a pass-through in terms of the money available for wages and benefits. So we're going into a bargaining right now for a contract that covers about 9,000 commercial office cleaners. It's clear that we're, from the initial, we haven't started formal bargaining, but clear that the owners are going to ask for some pretty massive concessions. Normally it's sort of, we kind of play this back and forth. Well, you guys are doing great. Oh no, we're broke. The economy's terrible. At this, this time we're kind of aware that this is a unique situation. So we are, we're kind of waiting for the second shoe to drop. And we've seen increasing numbers of buildings go into default, and they just, that building is just not going to be occupied anymore, and nobody's going to invest in it until the demand comes back. Like you said, residential conversion is possible for a pretty small subset of the commercial office buildings for a number of reasons. So that's not really the answer. It can help. It can certainly help, but it's not going to bring things back to where they are. The federal government coming back to work is really the biggest thing that we can, in terms of the federal policy. Obviously, the district government is already back to work in person, so that's not there. That's not. The mayor's been great on that, so there's really not a lot to do there. But it's, I think it's sort of, there's a little bit unknown how far down it's going to go, but we don't think it's gone anywhere near the bottom in terms of vacancy rates, rent per square foot, and then ultimately to the work.
Guys, you're representing workers from the entire region, not just.
Correct. Yeah.
Do you see similar problems in commercial buildings outside the region?
There's actually, there's kind of little pockets that are still doing okay, like some of the higher, like very high-end Class A commercial space. There's still some demand for that. Some suburban spaces are actually doing a little better because they're not in the, kind of the federal government pool on the, federal interactions with federal workforce. So they're not quite as, but generally things are down everywhere.
It seemed like someone's going to get some good bargains on commercial office space at some point, but I know
If they can figure out how to,
yeah.
they can figure out how to make money with space. Yeah.
We heard from a lot of small businesses that want places to be.
Yeah, it would be really nice if the market could sort itself out. It's going to be a values. Commercial downtown commercial real estate is not going to be valued as highly in the future as it was at times in the past. Nonetheless, you kind of hope the free market will do its thing eventually. Stable level, but it'll probably be at lower assessment levels. Property tax hit won't be done, but at least maybe the jobs will come back for your folks to some extent.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really good conversation. Really appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights. And again, just look forward to continuing to wait on the commission work as it moves forward.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Appreciate it.
Yes. I think it is.
I wanted to back
Martin.
everyone.